Hi, and welcome back to Noble Green Wines. We're continuing with our look at varietal wines, and today we're looking at some red varieties. And I wanted to start by talking about the varietal labelling of wines, because traditionally wines from France and most of Europe, it's named for the village or the chateau or the producer, and it's not really clear what the grape is in the wine. What emerges from a new world is this varietal labelling, where it's much more clear what it is. It's much more democratic in a way that you can understand wine more easily. It's stripped away some of the mystique. If you get a Pinot Noir or a Cab Sauv, you kind of know what you're getting, and it's a bit easier to understand than Chateau Petrus or Chassagne Montrachet, where a lot of what is in the wine is sort of hidden behind the label. The first wine I want to look at today is a Pinot Noir. Now, Pinot Noir is a bit of a fickle grape. Its history and its sort of spiritual homeland in Burgundy goes back at least 800 years, but it has been dated back to about 4th century AD. Now, over that time, you've had centuries and centuries of plantings and experimentation and working out that this vineyard here is slightly better than this vineyard lower down, and the one further up that's got slightly better angles to the sun is even better. Over the centuries, that sort of coalesced into the classification you have in Burgundy of village wines, Premier Cru, Grand Cru. A lot of that work means that plantings in the New World have accelerated quite quickly because it's easier to identify using geology and more modern sort of mapping techniques where the best sites are to plant these grapes, which is why in Central Otago, in about 30 years, they've rapidly caught up to Burgundy in terms of quality. Arguably, they're more consistent than Burgundy and better value. And it's the same across the wine world. In Napa and Sonoma, you're finding some really interesting and top quality Pinot Noirs. And in Chile, where this example is from, it's grown on the same limestone soils that you find throughout Burgundy. It's one of the best sites for the grape. Now, one of the problems with the grape, as well as finding the right vineyard, is it's got to be the right climatic conditions. It doesn't like a hot climate. But unfortunately, if it's too damp and wet, because it's a really thin-skinned variety, it's quite prone to rot, mildew, and just about any other vine disease you care to name. It's quite fickle, and people have spent fortunes trying to get it right. This example from Chile is really lovely. Single vineyard, vinified partially in new oak and second fill oak. Lovely. Typical Pinot raspberry fruit coming through, a little bit of cherry, a little bit of smokiness and spiciness from the oak on the finish. Lovely, quite generous fruit. Again, there's a cherry and raspberry coming through. A little bit of cranberry, a little bit of astringency. Quite low tannins. As I mentioned, it's a thin-skinned variety, so you don't get too much of that tannin, just a little powdery coating. Some of the more concentrated versions from Central Otago or more specially selected sites in Chile, you might get a little bit more concentration, a little bit more age worthiness, but this is 1.5 years, 2 years old. It's had a little bit of aging in barrel, drinking beautifully now. This is perfect for something like baked salmon. Something like rabbit and mustard is a traditional Burgundian dish that works really well with Pinot Noir. Just a really, really nice example of the grape. For our second wine today, we're going to turn it slightly on its head. We're talking about varietals sort of moving around the world and finding a second home, whereas Malbec is originally from Cahors in the south of France, and there and across France it tends to make quite fiercely tannic, quite robust, often called black wines. They're very good with food, particularly cassoulet, which comes from the same sort of area, quite a rich dish, and the tannins and the fierceness of the wine really cut through. In Argentina, it's a lot better known than it is from its homeland, and that's because it's really found its perfect sweet spot there. A lot of the vineyards in Argentina are much higher altitude, and what happens is the grapes ripen slightly differently. The high levels of ultraviolet means that you get more of the phenols and the pigments in the wine, and a lot of the fruit character, but less of the tannins, so it's ripening physiologically in a slightly different way. And what this does is it tames the grape a little bit, so you get more of that forward fruitiness, which you might be quite familiar with any Argentinian Malbec. They're still big wines, they're still quite tannic, but they don't have that fierce roughness that some French variety examples can have. Now with this, if we give it a little taste, quite a deep colour. There's still a lot of pigment in there from the grape skins. a lot of tannins, but immediately on the nose you're getting quite a lot of generosity of fruit. Lovely plum, damson, quite rich fruit. And again, on the palate, bags and bags of fruit. Really lovely. Almost juicy fruit. It's almost too much, but it's quite well balanced because it retains that acidity. The other advantage of the altitude is that you get those cool nights, what is called a diurnal variation, where you get those lovely warm days and cool nights, and it helps retain the acidity and freshness in the wine and stops it from becoming too flabby and disjointed. Now, this is really good food wine. Roast duck, suckling pig, all those sort of things would work really well because it still has those grippy tannins, but they're quite ripe. They're not clinging onto your mouth like a dry cup of tea would. Really good example. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, phylloxera devastated most of the vineyards of Europe, and the grafting technique of European vines onto American rootstocks really saved it. Now, a lot of vines were taken around the world as cuttings. Vines are very easy to root. They take cuttings very easily. They graft relatively easily. And a lot of the credit for Syrah or Shiraz being introduced to Australia has been given to a Dr. Joseph Busby. Now, he wasn't the only person to bring them, but a lot of the oldest cuttings and plantings in the Barossa, some of the old vines there, which are now 100, 120 years old, that make some of the most expensive wines from the area, are allegedly traced back to him and his influence on farming techniques and everything else that helped get the ball rolling in South Australia. This example is from Barossa Valley in South Australia, and as soon as you pour it, you can immediately see, compared to the other two wines, this is very deep in colour. Another aspect with Syrah or Shiraz is it can develop quite high levels of alcohol, and again with yeasts bringing out particular characteristics in the wine. There are some yeasts that allow very high levels of alcohol. I've seen Shirazes at 17, even 18% alcohol. For me, that's a little bit unbalanced. This example is 14.5, and that really is the sweet spot for me for Syrah, whether it's from the Rhone or from Barossa. From the Rhone, tends to be a single varietal in the northern Rhones, Hermitage, Saint-Joseph, that area. As you move further south, it tends to be more in a blend. Châteauneuf-du-Pape, Gigondas, and most southern French reds have Syrah somewhere in their makeup. As Shiraz in Australia, it is almost invariably a single varietal. You'll occasionally see it blended with Cabernet, but this example from Barossa is textbook. Lovely nose. Again, bags and bags of fruit on there. And on the palate, this is definitely a full-bodied wine. It really fills the mouth with, again, lots of those sort of mulberry and plum and damson fruit. Lovely prickly acidity, sort of holding it all together. The tannins aren't too fierce, but there's a lovely smoky finish, again, from the oak barrels and the oak aging that the wine has had. There's nothing else that goes better with this than something chucked on the barbie and char grilled, ribeye steak, or anything really. There's a reason the Australians barbecue so much food when they have wines like this to do it with. So, in the meantime, enjoy your wines, and we'll see you next time for sparkling wine.